Members of the media took pictures, including Tom Brenner of the New York Times, whose photographs captured Trump's scripted words, including his handwritten notations, allowing easy comparison between what was intended and what was delivered. A comparison of the two is remarkable. On the top of page 2, these words appear, quote, "In saying, as I have said before, that I accept our intelligence community's conclusions about Russia's meddling in the 2016 election." The president read those words verbatim. And then he added what he'd written in his own hand, "There was no collusion." The misspelling is his. He then continued to follow the script.
In a key sentence in my remarks, I said the word would instead of wouldn't. The sentence should have been, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be Russia. Sort of a double negative. I have on numerous occasions noted our intelligence findings that Russians attempted to interfere in our elections.
Okay, so far so good, but then came this deletion. Quote, "Anyone involved in that meddling to justice." Stricken, presumably by his own hand. Clearly he was supposed to say anybody involved in that meddling either will be or should be brought to justice, but he just couldn't do it. Probably because he doesn't believe it. His deviation from the script is an admission that he has no desire to see anybody involved in the meddling brought to justice. It's just that simple. The stricken words are a trial lawyer's dream, reminiscent of when Charles Manson's prosecutor, Vincent Bugliosi, famously lamented that O.J. Simpson, quote, "made sufficiently incriminating statements in his interview with police that alone could have convicted him." Assuming the president ever sits down with special counsel Robert Mueller, Mueller could spend an afternoon questioning Trump on this deletion alone. For starters, did you strike those words, Mr. President? Do you not believe those words, Mr. President? Who did you have in mind when you struck those words, Mr. President? To the extent it is proven that Russia meddled in our elections, would you not like to see those perpetrators brought to justice? Who do you believe should be spared justice for the Russian attack? You know, usually it's what the president says that raises questions. This time it's the other way around. It's what he would not utter. This week, the New York Times broke the story that weeks before his inauguration, President Trump was given definitive proof that Putin had interfered with the election. And joining me now is one of the co-authors, David Sanger. He's the Times national security correspondent with a brand new book, very timely, "The Perfect Weapon, War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age." David, you know the big story today. It's Michael Cohen presumably having taped Trump. What is Robert Mueller's interest in that issue, if any?
Well, it's not clear how interested he is in that, but clearly if you look at what Mueller has done, Michael, over the past couple of months, he did an indictment of the people who ran the Internet Research Agency. They're the ones in Russia who put out all of those ads and other commentary on Facebook and other social media. Then, 10 days ago, he indicted 12 officers of the GRU, the Russian military intelligence unit that broke into the Democratic National Committee and that then worked with WikiLeaks, created false personas, created Guccifer 2.0. When you read those indictments together, what's missing from it is whether or not they got help from any Americans. And the people who clearly Mueller is trying to press for information on that is Paul Manafort, goes to trial pretty soon, Rick Gates, his associate, of course, General Michael Flynn, who was the National Security Advisor briefly under President Trump, and you have to also add Michael Cohen into that in case he heard any of that along the way. So this question of the deletions that you were referring to gets to what's really the central intrigue that we just don't know the answer to in the Mueller material, which is, were there Americans, and were there Americans who were linked to the campaign or close to President Trump who somehow interacted with either the GRU, the Internet Research Agency, or other Russians? That takes you to our story this weekend. Yeah, I'm sorry, go right ahead.
something that occurs to me after reading your book is that Mueller is operating largely on a cyber evidentiary trail as he attempts to answer those questions.
He certainly is. And if you go into that indictment of the 12 GRU officers, what's remarkable about it is he has transcripts of texts, emails, other conversations. And I've been told by people in the intelligence community that he actually didn't get that from U.S. intelligence, but that instead he was able to put it together from foreign intelligence agencies that cooperated and from legal process here in the United States. Now, that raises an interesting question because so many internet communications go through the infrastructure set up in the U.S., servers in the U.S., or AT&T or Verizon or AOL or any number of other internet service providers, Google, of course, and Apple, that it's very possible that the GRU didn't realize that some of these conversations were running through U.S. servers, which ultimately Mueller may have been able to get access to.
David, I hear a criticism from supporters of the president, often from radio callers, who say to me, yeah, but our hands aren't clean. And there's an academic at Carnegie Mellon named Dov Levin, who I've had on my SiriusXM program, who did a study and said that between World War II's end and the year 2000, 81 times in 61 nations, we've meddled. What thoughts on that do you have?
That's certainly true. The United States has interfered, particularly through the Cold War, in elections in Italy in the late 1940s, Latin America, of course, in the 50s and 60s, Japan. We staged a coup in Iran in the mid-1950s. So certainly on the question of meddling in elections or interfering in elections, the United States does not at all have clean hands. And, when you go through The Perfect Weapon, as you and I were discussing earlier this week, Michael, we also don't have clean hands on the question of cyber intrusions into other countries. The only way that our cyber defenses and our cyber offenses work is by getting inside the networks of foreign countries, and of course that's a violation of law in those countries.
Right.
So while you could come after the Russians and say, what were you doing inside the networks of the DNC, they can easily turn around and say, clearly you are inside the networks of Russian intelligence and so forth. And this is one of the essential problems with, it's one of the essential problems with cyber, which is we have wrapped so much secrecy as a government in our cyber operations, offensive and defensive, that we haven't been able to publicly debate any ground rules about what's off limits and what's not. So if you and I sat down and said...
I learned that from the book. Yeah, I was going to say, it's totally uncharted territory, as your book makes clear. Hey, David, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. Go enjoy that weather behind you.
Yeah, it's not so rough out here, Michael. Great to be with you.
Still to come, the gracious gesture heard round the world. NBC's Hallie Jackson cut off by Sarah Sanders at a White House press conference. The Hill's Jordan Fabian comes to her defense. Is this a sign of new alliances in the media? He'll tell us next.
This is CNN's coverage of politics this week via the Smirconish talk show. That's on Saturdays from 9 in the morning till 10. It's now 10:42, and I'm skipping past the commercials.
Was asleep at the switch. Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job.
The 2000s, tomorrow at 9 on CNN.
I'd like to invite you to Classic Chevrolet on our campus in Mentor, where your brand new Chevrolet is right here waiting.
time.
An alliance developed this week regarding the president's ongoing war with the media, or so it seemed. First, some background. You'll remember that during the president's visit to Chequers, the country home of British Prime Minister Theresa May, he ignored questions from CNN's own Jim Acosta and chose to call on John Roberts of Fox News.
That's such dishonest reporting because, of course, it happens to be NBC, which is possibly worse than CNN.
Mr. President, since you attacked CNN, can I ask you a question?
John Roberts, go ahead, John.
Can I ask you a question?
No. John Roberts, go ahead. CNN's fake news. I don't take questions. I don't take questions from CNN. CNN is fake news. I don't take questions from CNN. John Roberts of Fox.
So Roberts then asked his question without making any reference to what the president had just said. He was criticized for not calling out the president, but arguably had shown loyalty to his employer first. Then came this moment on Wednesday in the White House briefing room. NBC's Hallie Jackson was quizzing Sarah Sanders about the White House claim that when the president had said no when asked about whether Putin had interfered in the election, he was just saying no to any more questions. Sanders tried to move on to the next questioner. Here's the end of their back and forth.
When he sees that he's misspoken, he comes out and he says that.
Jordan, follow up on
I'm going to
the
keep
second
moving.
question.
Jordan, go ahead.
Well, just to follow up on my second question, Sarah.
Sorry,
you told Josh.
You've asked two.
I
I'm
have
going to move on
two.
to Jordan.
You told Josh the president has been
Once again, Hallie, I'm
critical
moving on
about
to Jordan. Jordan, go ahead.
So she was trying to call on Jordan Fabian of The Hill. Here's what happened next.
Sorry, Hallie, go ahead if you want.
Thanks, Jordan. You said to
Actually,
Josh
I'm
that
going to take a question from Jordan.
Critical of Vladimir Putin. I just want to know when, because I don't think any of us remember. At least I don't remember a time when the president has publicly called up Vladimir Putin.
I think by stating the fact that the president said that Russia interfered with our election, that's a pretty bold call out of another world leader. Jordan, go ahead.
Joining me now is Jordan Fabian. Hey, Jordan, gutsy on your part insofar as when you defer, maybe Sarah Sanders isn't going to come back to you with another question.
Yeah, Michael, that thought entered my mind right after I had done that. But in the moment, I viewed it as a professional courtesy to Hallie. All of us in that room are trying to get our questions in, and follow-up questions are a very important part of trying to get to the bottom of some of these answers we're trying to get. So, Hallie hadn't finished yet. I've been covering the White House for 3.5 years. Reporters have always had the chance to ask follow-up questions in those briefings, and I thought it was important for her to be able to finish her line of questioning before the questioning moved to me.
So as I was watching you on Wednesday, of course I was thinking about Jim Acosta and John Roberts. Were you thinking about the way that had gone down in the United Kingdom?
I honestly wasn't, Michael. When you're sitting in the chair in the briefing room, you're basically just trying to get your questions straight and make sure you don't sound like a moron on television, quite frankly. So, I was just trying to get myself in the mindset to ask my question to Sarah Sanders, and then this interaction happened. And look, I'm not going to lie, we've talked a lot behind the scenes about press corps unity, about making sure all of us can do our jobs, and in that moment I thought deferring to Hallie was the right thing to do.
Okay, and that, of course, is my big question. Is this a sign of things to come? You just said you've had conversations with other members of the White House press corps. Do you think this may unfold in press conferences to come?
I hope so, that in the sense that all of us in the White House press corps have respect for one another and do our best to make sure we can all do our jobs. I sort of view it in a little bit of a different light. There's this dynamic now, partially because of how the president treats the media, that the media is the opposition party and we are tasked with defeating him. That's not how we view it. We are just trying to do our jobs to report on the president and the White House and tell readers what's going on. And really what I tried to do was make sure that one of my colleagues had the chance to do her job. And hopefully, in the future, if it happened to me or somebody else, we would pay it forward.
Final question. There's something on my mind as to whom you owe a duty. I would like to think that you owe a duty to the American people, but you actually owe a duty to The Hill.